The Zimbabwean government and the European Union have signed two financial agreements worth 47 million euros in health and electoral processes. The financing agreements signed in Harare as part of the 2022 Annual Action Plan for European Union's support of Zimbabwe. 148 million euros have been set aside for Zimbabwe for 2 years.
The continued support to our health sector by the EU and the development partners is commendable and has been key in strengthening our health service delivery and our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The country remains focused at achieving the high standard of healthcare delivery and to attain high quality of life for all its citizens. We are cognizant of the fact that on our own we might take longer to achieve this aspiration, hence the need to forge strong partnerships with all key stakeholders, including development partners like the European Union. On the other hand, the support to the Zimbabwean electoral process will be implemented by the government and UNDP and aims to contribute to the consolidation of democracy and peace, with particular emphasis on inclusion, particularly representation from women, youth, and persons with disabilities in the democratic processes. The support comes at an opportune time when government is prioritizing the strengthening of good governance in order to foster economic development. Globally, it has been acknowledged that building institutional capacities is critical for economic growth and development.
The second financing agreement concerns our support to the upcoming election in 2023. And looking to next year, I think we all agree that credible and peaceful elections will be a key element that will allow Zimbabwe to create a prosperous environment and to make the National Development Strategy 1 and Vision 2030 a reality. To contribute to that, and in line with the NDS 1 strategy of strengthening the capacity of independent commissions, the European Union is committing today 4.5 million euros to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to deliver on its mandate. And actually, when I presented my credentials to His Excellency President Mnangagwa back in October, and I asked him how could the EU support elections next year, he suggested a support to Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which I think is a good thing, because also we have done it in the past, and I think it's also a continuation of our engagement. So I'm very happy we can make this happen today, and obviously we have also other donors joining, in particular France, who is also a member of what we call the Team Europe, and I think the funds will be then administered by the UNDP in a basket fund. Finally, the support to SEC will also be complemented by additional support to civil society on electoral litigation, advocacy, voter education and monitoring.
Well, for some reaction, we're now joined by Farai Maguwu, who's the Executive Director at the Centre for Natural Resource Governance in Zimbabwe. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Peter, for having me.
All right, so one of the questions that stand out for me straight away when I hear the word financial arrangement, financial agreement, what do we know about what they are exactly? Are these donations? Are these loans? What are they?
Well, it sounds to me that these are donations, and the European Union has been very much involved, especially in social service, especially health, food security, agriculture. They've been doing a lot of things despite the sour relations with Zimbabwe. Zimbabweans have benefited a lot from these donations from the EU, which sometimes have been channeled through multilateral agencies like the World Bank, UNDP, mainly because of the transparency and accountability issues with the Zimbabwe government. So I strongly believe that these are donations, and Zimbabwe is not going to pay back this money to the EU.
All right, transparency, I guess, is going to be key, given that you have a health sector that's hemorrhaging health practitioners at this time. I believe as many as 4,000 left 2021. And the health facilities, resources, badly in need of support, so that the EU would want to make sure that these funds actually go to these areas.
Yeah, I think ordinarily they would have just given the money to the Ministry of Health. But when you see that there is an intermediary in the form of UNDP, it's a diplomatic way of trying to ensure that the money is not misused or is not diverted to other things apart from the purpose for which it was given. So that's why institutions like UNDP come into play, because definitely Zimbabwe has got a crisis of priorities. Like recently, we saw the ruling party importing hundreds of 4x4 vehicles for campaign in 2023, for the 2023 election. But this is the same country where most of our district hospitals don't have a single ambulance. And those which have an ambulance, it was acquired probably 10, 15, 20 years ago. And yet every 5 years, the ruling party and the government, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars buying trucks for chiefs, for parliamentarians, for the ruling party officials for campaigning. So I think the EU is very much aware of that possibility that the money can be channeled towards elections. And that's why the UNDP must be kind of the conduit for receiving that money.
How are relations between Europe, the EU and Zimbabwe developing? One hears senior politicians often talk about sanctions from the European Union and the United States. And the European Union always included in that conversation. What's your understanding about the status? Because to see these grants, donations being made, doesn't speak to a country that's suffering sanctions from this economic bloc.
Yeah, I think it depends with which side of the debate one is sitting. But when President Mnangagwa took over in 2017, he declared that Zimbabwe was open for business. He also said his government was up for engagement with the international community. And I think these donations which are coming to his government can also be interpreted as some fruits of his engagement policy, where he wants to embrace former enemies. But then you also see that the sanctions mantra has been a two-edged sword, which the government also use very strongly, especially when they are under scrutiny on the issues of human rights, transparency, accountability. They will raise the sanctions card. So if you read the official newspaper today, the Herald, they are glorifying the president's engagement policy, that this donation shows that the president is very successful in engaging. But when it comes to why is it that Zimbabwe is not developing, why is it that criminals are not being arrested, then they raise the sanctions card. And if the EU also tries to engage Zimbabwe to improve on human rights, on governance, on democracy, the sanctions card is raised. So in a way, government is saying, yes, if you want to come and give us money, you are welcome. But if you want to talk about human rights and democracy, then we'll show you the door.
Nick Mangwana, who's the government spokesperson, I think quotes Minister Mchangwa saying government acknowledges the progressive scaling down of sanctions imposed by the European Union on Zimbabwe, but still calls for their total removal. The motto, Zimbabwe and EU together tomorrow, today, rightly speaks volumes of the long-lasting relations envisioned in unison. It seems like a very, not a clear message when one looks at it. You either have sanctions or you don't. Are the sanctions being scaled down? Is that how you interpret it?
Mm-hmm. Sanctions have been scaling down since 2013, when the EU removed Zimbabwe Mining Development Corporation from the sanctions list, and which facilitated the entry of Zimbabwe's diamonds into Antwerp. And then the number of people who were on the sanctions list have been going down significantly. And now I think we've got a handful who remain. So in the end, I actually think Zimbabwe is now speaking from a position of strength. It's no longer the situation that it was in 2002 and 2003 when the sanctions were imposed, that Zimbabwe did not have a lot of resources at its disposal. But fast forward to 2022, now you've got countries like China, which have invaded all the economic spheres of Zimbabwe. They are looting Zimbabwe's natural resources. Zimbabwe's leaders today are multimillionaires because of the deals they enter into with the Chinese. So they really, some of them, they really wish that the sanctions remain, because if anything, the sanctions gives them a narrative to defend themselves. And the sanctions have also allowed them to be as corrupt as possible and blame everything on sanctions. So I think the EU is actually trying to diplomatically tone down on the soured relations and try to engage Zimbabwe. But you'll be surprised that it's actually the Zimbabwean government officials who don't want the sanctions to be lifted, because if the sanctions are lifted, then there's no excuse why the civil servants in Zimbabwe must continue earning less than $100 per month. There is no reason why our roads represent a country that has been at war for the past 20 or 30 years. There's no reason why our hospitals are death traps where there is no medication, the staff are demoralized. We have suffered massive brain drain. And if the sanctions are removed, then we have to face the reality and ask the right questions as to why is our country continuing to sink in this bottomless pit, despite the abundance of natural resources and human capital that we have, which is better than most of the countries in the region, but it's not serving the economic interests of the country.
All right, let's cross the Atlantic then. Zidera is still in play. I wonder if American institutions are watching the European Union. Might they start to soften their position in terms of the current sanctions program in play at the moment?
Well, I think if you check very carefully, EU and the US positions on Zimbabwe have been very identical. And I think they also share notes. And from what I've heard, the United States of America is very keen to engage the Zimbabwe government. And actually, engagements have been taking place. But at the same time, they also have their own principles on what needs to be done for the Zidera to go away. And it comes back to the point I was making, whether the Zimbabwe government is also making efforts to ensure that the sanctions are completely removed. I think there are some benchmarks in terms of the respect for human rights, property rights, transparency, accountability. And right now, as we're speaking, I think you are aware of the PVO bill, a very draconian piece of legislation that seeks to shut democratic space in Zimbabwe, that seeks to close civil society organizations so that they don't operate. You may also be aware of the so-called patriotic bill, which gives the ruling party the power to decide who is patriotic and who is not patriotic, and arrest people whom they deem to be unpatriotic or working with the so-called foreign enemies to undermine the interests of Zimbabwe. So those maneuvers, which I believe may actually be pushed by some die-hard extremists in the government who are pushing a very narrow, selfish agenda. If those interests are not curtailed by President Mnangagwa, then his efforts at re-engaging countries like the US, the European Union, will come to naught. So my call is for the president to really be very careful with some of these extremists who are trying to isolate Zimbabwe so that they can use that isolation to justify corruption, plunder of resources, and impunity, and justify everything that is because we are under sanctions.
All right, perhaps finally, I believe 4.25 million euros also being given to Zimbabwe to help it with its elections process. That would mean, I guess, that Zimbabwe really needs to pass a high test in terms of free and fair elections next year.
Well, I think that money is too little, too late. Elections in Zimbabwe and elsewhere is not just about the voting day. It's about the processes that happen 2-3 years before the election. It's the ability of the opposition and the ruling party to enjoy equal access to the media and space to mobilize people, which is not happening in Zimbabwe at the moment. So I think that is simply a donation for ZEC to buy vehicles and perhaps increase their salaries. But without real engagement, especially looking at SADC, even South Africa, engaging the Zimbabwe government to make sure that there is enough democratic space that can pass for a free and fair election, I really think that money is just a Christmas gift to Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and it will do very little, if any, to protect Zimbabweans, especially in rural areas where violence is already rearing its ugly head, and create an even playing field where all political parties that want to contest for power enjoy the protection of the law and access to the media. I don't think that money is going to address that. And giving it straight to ZEC also has got its own challenges, because we think ZEC also needs a lot of external support and help in terms of making sure that it is impartial, that it executes its mandate with diligence and integrity. And all that at the moment is missing.
Farai Maguwu, thanks very much indeed for joining us and your analysis. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Peter. Have a good evening.
Good evening. All right, so 47 million euros to Zimbabwe. It looks like donations from the EU, and it's great news for the country. 41 million of those euros are going to be towards health outcomes in the country, and 6 million towards the electoral processes in the country. So great news for the country, and it looks as if, as the government says, a scaling down of the sanctions program by the European Union towards Zimbabwe, and the United States perhaps looking from across the Atlantic. We'll have to wait and see.